Hey everybody, welcome to Chapter 17, Lesson 1, where we begin our discussion of the Vietnam War. And our essential questions for this lesson and this section on Vietnam, there's two. How does military conflict divide people within a culture, people that live together? How does it divide them in what ways? And then, should citizens support government during wartime? And really, this question could even be one of the reasons, or the answer to this question could even be one of the things that divide a people within a culture during a time of war. So on this first slide, what we're going to look at here is kind of the backstory of Vietnam, why America even cares about Vietnam to begin with. What's the rationale? What's the purpose behind it? Why do we get involved? And then it'll see us here early on in the history of Vietnam taking and giving support to some unlikely allies, a group called the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh. And what we'll see is that our support of them is going to be unusual. And so why would that be? Why would our support of the Viet Minh be unusual? And I think we need to go all the way back to help us understand this. We need to go all the way back to 1877, when France is out colonizing other places around the world, looking for natural resources and markets for its goods. And it discovers and stumbles on a group of countries that we know today as Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. And it calls these countries together French Indochina. That's what it calls it. This is French Indochina. And it remains conquered and run by France all the way up to 1941. And this really makes some Vietnamese extraordinarily angry. It really upsets them that they are ruled so by this kind of colonial power, and it prevents them from having and living and doing their own thing. One of the guys that is actually made very angry about this, one of the guys that really is upset by this living arrangement is this guy right here. His name's Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh is going to begin to develop ideas around resisting the French colonization of Vietnam. But all of that is put on hold when 1941 rolls around, because during World War II, especially during 1941, 42, 43, 44, and 45, Indochina is going to come underneath Japanese control. The French, when they end up surrendering to Germany, will cede control of French Indochina to the Japanese. And this is going to kind of put a freeze on whatever plans Ho Chi Minh had with France, because they don't control the country anymore. So step one, the first thing to realize here, take a look at this graphic organizer together, is that Vietnam had first been conquered by the French and then conquered by the Japanese in World War II. That's the kind of first two things to understand. Ho Chi Minh, this leader who is a communist in Vietnam, he decides to organize a communist rebel army called the Viet Minh. And I'd like you to actually write that in your notes on the right-hand side, Viet Minh Communist Rebel Army. And we actually send help to the Viet Minh to fight the Japanese. Remember that during World War II, Japan is our enemy. So even if a communist group wants to fight them, we're going to support that communist group. And don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, we were allied with the communist Soviet Union during World War II, so it's normal for us to support other communist groups that are fighting our enemies as well. That all will change when World War II ends and we enter the Cold War, because when France tries to reconquer Vietnam, come back in after the Japanese are gone, and when they try to come back in, we're going to work against the Viet Minh in an attempt to help France retake French Indochina. And they drive the Viet Minh into hiding, France does, as it starts to win this war. But then, as the Viet Minh flee into the countryside, the French begin struggling against a new type of warfare called guerrilla warfare. And a guerrilla warrior is a person who belongs to an armed band that carries out surprise attacks and sabotage. It's not traditional warfare. You hit a target and you run away. You might even be a civilian. You might not, you might even spend your days working in the fields and in the farms. And then at nighttime, you take up a gun and you go out and you fight the enemy. And they really struggle with this, so that by 1954, France has almost been pushed entirely out of Vietnam. So from 1946 to 1954, France will try and reclaim Vietnam, but it's unable to do so. Only the areas here in gray are controlled by the French. Everything else that you see in red is controlled by the Viet Minh and their leader, Ho Chi Minh. President Eisenhower is really worried about this because he's afraid that if Vietnam becomes communist, that means that all the other countries that used to be a part of French Indochina will become communist too, right? So if communist Vietnam happens, then maybe Laos and Cambodia will go communist too, and that would be terrible. Remember, we're looking to contain those nations. And Eisenhower calls this the domino theory. He says, if Vietnam falls to communism, so will those other nations like Laos and Cambodia. So where is this going to take us then with this fear that the French are going to lose, the French are not going to be able to beat the Viet Minh, and that they'll be kicked out of Vietnam and it will become communist?